Mother Bear fell into a trap. When she saw what's lying under it, she was shocked. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The early morning sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. Dewdrops sparkled on broad green leaves, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of wildflowers through the air. This was Whispering Pines Forest, where animals roamed freely, and the rhythm of nature continued undisturbed day after day. Among the forest dwellers was Ursa, a large brown bear with a coat that shimmered like copper in the sunlight. Her eyes, deep and knowing, surveyed the forest with the wisdom of a creature who had survived many seasons. As she moved through the underbrush, her paws left barely a sound, remarkable for an animal of her size. Behind her followed her two cubs, barely 6 months old, still clumsy and curious about the world around them. The smaller cub, whom Ursa had mentally named Tiny for his size at birth, tumbled over a fallen log and let out a surprised grunt. His sister, the more adventurous of the two, whom Ursa thought of as brave, nudged him up with her snout. Ursa watched them with her heart full of fierce love. These cubs were everything to her, the center of her world, the reason she hunted and protected and survived. "Stay close," she seemed to tell them with a low, rumbling sound. The cubs understood her meaning, if not her words. They huddled closer as they moved deeper into the forest, toward the creek where fat salmon fought their way upstream. It would be a good day for fishing, Ursa thought. Her cubs needed to grow strong before the cold months arrived. The forest sounds surrounded them. Birds calling to one another, squirrels chattering as they leapt from branch to branch, and somewhere in the distance the faint sound of water rushing over rocks. But then Ursa froze. Her sensitive nose had caught something else, something that didn't belong in the forest, something human. Ursa's muscles tensed. The memory of an encounter with humans 2 seasons ago still haunted her. The loud bang that had echoed through the trees, the searing pain in her left hind leg. She still carried the scar, a reminder to stay vigilant, to keep her cubs safe from the most dangerous creatures in the forest. She sniffed the air again. The human scent was old, perhaps from the previous day. She relaxed slightly but remained cautious. Humans rarely entered this deep into the forest without a purpose, and that purpose often meant danger for the forest inhabitants. "Stay," she commanded her cubs with another low sound. They sensed her tension and obeyed immediately, crouching down in the tall grass, nearly invisible with their brown fur. Ursa moved forward alone, following the human scent. It led her toward a small clearing she knew well, where berry bushes grew in abundance. She and her cubs had feasted there just days ago, the sweet juices staining their muzzles as they gorged themselves on the ripe fruit. But as she approached the clearing, something felt wrong. The birds had gone quiet. The usual rustling of small creatures in the underbrush was absent. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. Ursa slowed her pace, placing each paw carefully, silently. The human scent grew stronger, mixed with something metallic and unnatural. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, her keen eyes scanning the area. The berry bushes were still heavy with fruit, their branches bending under the weight. The ground was covered with fallen berries, crushed and fermenting in the sun. But there was something different about the center of the clearing, something that hadn't been there before. A large patch of leaves and twigs looked slightly raised, as if the earth beneath had swollen overnight. To an untrained eye, it might appear natural, just another feature of the forest floor. But Ursa knew better. She had walked this clearing countless times. She knew every rock, every bush, every dip in the ground. And this was new. The human scent was strongest here, mingled with that metallic smell that made her nose wrinkle. Every instinct told her to turn back, to return to her cubs and find another place to fish, another place to forage. But curiosity, that dangerous trait she hoped her cubs hadn't inherited too strongly, kept her rooted to the spot. Slowly, carefully, she approached the suspicious patch of ground. With each step, the unease in her chest grew stronger. The metallic smell burned her nostrils now. She extended one paw, intending to brush away some of the leaves, when suddenly a sound. Not from the disguised patch of ground, but from behind it. A small, whimpering cry that she didn't recognize. Not a deer, not a wolf, not any forest creature she knew. It came again, louder this time, a sound of pain or fear or both. Ursa circled the patch, keeping a safe distance, trying to locate the source of the cry, and then she saw it. A small opening in the ground, partially concealed by a fallen log. The cry came from inside. Forgetting caution, Ursa moved closer to the opening. The human scent was overwhelming now, but mixed with it was something else. Something young and frightened and hurt. Something that called to the mother in her, despite all her instincts warning her to flee. She peered into the darkness of the small cave or burrow. At first, she saw nothing. Then, as her eyes adjusted, a shape came into focus. A tiny human cub, no bigger than her own tiny, lay curled on the dirt floor. Its face was streaked with dirt and tears, its strange, furless limbs scratched and bloodied. It wore coverings like humans did, but they were torn and soiled. The human cub opened its eyes and saw Ursa. Instead of screaming in terror as Ursa expected, it reached out one small hand toward her, making that whimpering sound again. Its eyes, wide and glistening with tears, locked onto hers. And in that moment, something shifted inside Ursa. The human cub was not a threat, it was not the enemy. It was simply a lost cub, alone and afraid, just as her own would be if separated from her. The fierce maternal instinct that drove her to protect her cubs expanded in that instant to include this strange, vulnerable creature. But even as she considered how to help the human cub, a sudden sharp cracking sound split the air, followed by the rustle of disturbed leaves. The ground beneath her front paws gave way, and Ursa felt herself falling forward. The disguised patch of ground was collapsing, revealing a deep pit beneath. A trap. As she fell, time seemed to slow. She saw the human cub's eyes widen in horror. She heard her own cubs calling for her from the edge of the clearing where she'd left them. And she felt a terrible certainty that she had made a fatal mistake. The trap was meant for her all along. The human cub was the bait. Ursa's massive body crashed down into the pit, her claws scrabbling desperately at the edges as she fell. The walls of the pit were too steep, lined with smooth wooden planks that offered no purchase for her powerful claws. She landed heavily on the dirt floor, the impact knocking the breath from her body. Above her, the false forest floor, cleverly disguised with leaves and twigs, had completely given way, revealing a square of bright sky overhead. For several moments, Ursa lay stunned, her mind struggling to make sense of what had happened. The pit was deep, at least twice her height when standing on her hind legs. The walls were solid, the craftsmanship undeniably human. This was no accident, no natural formation. This was deliberate, calculated, designed specifically to capture something as large and powerful as herself. A soft whimper drew her attention. The human cub. In her panic, she had almost forgotten about it. She turned her head to see the small creature huddled against the far wall of the pit, its arms wrapped around its knees, its body trembling with fear, or cold, or both. It still wore those strange human coverings, a red outer layer torn at the shoulder, and blue leg coverings caked with dirt. The human cub looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. It couldn't be more than 5 or 6 seasons old, Ursa guessed, comparing it to the human cubs she had glimpsed from a distance in her earlier years. Its hair was the color of autumn leaves, matted with dirt and twigs. A female, Ursa sensed, though she couldn't have explained how she knew. "Mommy," the human cub whispered, the sound barely audible even to Ursa's sensitive ears. The word meant nothing to Ursa, but the tone, that mixture of hope and fear and desperate longing, that she understood. It was the same sound her cubs made when they called for her, when they were frightened or hurt or simply needed her presence, the sound of a cub calling for its mother. Ursa felt a sudden rush of anger. Where was this cub's mother? How had it come to be here, alone in this pit, used as bait in a trap meant for her? No mother, human or bear, would willingly place her cub in such danger. From above, she heard the frightened cries of her own cubs. They had disobeyed her, following her into the clearing despite her command to stay hidden. Now they peered down into the pit, their small faces framed by the opening above, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Stay back!" Ursa roared, a sound that reverberated off the walls of the pit. Her cubs flinched but didn't retreat. "Go! Hide!" she commanded, knowing they understood her meaning if not her exact thoughts. But they remained where they were, unwilling to leave their mother. The human cub flinched at Ursa's roar, pressing herself more tightly against the wall. Tears streamed down her dirty face. "I want my mommy," she whimpered. "Please help me." Again, Ursa didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. The desperation in the little one's voice touched something deep within her, that instinct to protect, to comfort, to mother. Despite everything, despite the trap and the danger and the fact that this was a human cub, Ursa felt her anger giving way to something else, a determination to help this lost, frightened creature. Cautiously, moving slowly so as not to frighten the human cub further, Ursa approached. The cub's eyes widened, but she didn't scream or try to flee, perhaps because there was nowhere to go, or perhaps because she sensed, as cubs often did, that Ursa meant her no harm. Ursa sniffed at the cub, taking in her scent, a mixture of human smell, soap and those strange coverings, and something uniquely her own, like wildflowers and earth after rain. The cub held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as Ursa's nose brushed against her hair, her cheek, her small hands. "My name is Ruby," the human cub whispered. "Please don't eat me." Ursa snorted softly, almost amused, as if she would eat a cub, human or otherwise. She was a mother, not a monster. From above, her own cubs whined anxiously. Ursa looked up at them, torn between her instinct to comfort them and her growing concern for this human cub, this Ruby. Her cubs needed her, but they were at least safe for now. This little one was trapped with her, injured and afraid. Making a decision, Ursa settled her large body onto the dirt floor beside Ruby, careful to leave enough space that the cub wouldn't feel threatened. She made a soft, rumbling sound deep in her throat, the same sound she used to comfort her own cubs when they were frightened. To her surprise, Ruby seemed to understand. The human cub's trembling subsided slightly. She uncurled from her tight ball and shifted slightly closer to Ursa's warmth. "You're not going to hurt me?" Ruby asked, her voice small but steadier than before. Ursa merely blinked at her, continuing her gentle rumbling. After a moment's hesitation, Ruby reached out one small hand and touched Ursa's fur. The touch was light, tentative, ready to withdraw at the slightest sign of displeasure. When Ursa remained still, Ruby grew bolder, gently stroking the bear's thick coat. "You're so soft," Ruby murmured, "like my teddy bear at home." She paused, her face crumpling a little. "I miss home, I miss my mommy and daddy." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. Ursa nudged Ruby gently with her nose, a gesture that said, "Don't cry. I'm here." It was the same thing she would have done for her own cubs. Above them, her cubs had grown silent, watching the strange interaction between their mother and the human cub with curious eyes. Ursa could see their confusion. Why was their mother being gentle with this strange creature? But they trusted her, as cubs always trusted their mothers, to know what she was doing. Ruby leaned against Ursa's side, seemingly drawing comfort from the bear's warmth and steady presence. Ursa allowed it, even as her mind raced, trying to make sense of this situation and figure out a way to escape. The pit was too deep to jump out of, and the walls too smooth to climb. They were truly trapped. As the minutes passed, turning into hours, Ruby's fear of Ursa seemed to fade entirely. She began to talk, a steady stream of words that meant nothing to Ursa, but seemed to comfort the human cub. She pointed to herself repeatedly saying, "Ruby," and then pointed to Ursa with a questioning look. Ursa merely blinked at her. Names, in the way humans understood them, meant little to bears. She was who she was: mother, protector, survivor. "I'll call you Honey," Ruby decided, patting Ursa's shoulder. Because you're a bear, and bears like honey, right?" Ursa snorted softly. She did indeed like honey when she could find it. How did this human cub know that? The sun moved across the sky above them, its light shifting in the pit. Ursa's cubs remained at the edge, sometimes disappearing for short periods but always returning. They wanted to join their mother in the pit. She could see it in their restless movements, their anxious whines, but they couldn't find a way down that wouldn't harm them. For that, at least, Ursa was grateful. If they had jumped, they might have broken their legs, or worse. As the afternoon wore on, Ruby's stomach growled loudly. The human cub pressed her hands against her belly, wincing. "I'm so hungry," she whimpered. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." Ursa understood hunger. She nudged Ruby gently, then looked up at her own cubs meaningfully. They perked up, heads tilted in question. Ursa made a sound that they recognized, the sound that meant, "Find food." Whether they understood that the food wasn't for them, Ursa couldn't know. But they disappeared from the edge of the pit, hopefully to search for something edible. In the meantime, Ursa nudged Ruby toward the far corner of the pit, where a small trickle of water seeped from between two of the wooden planks. It wasn't much, but it would help with the cub's thirst. Ruby understood. She cupped her small hands under the trickle, collecting enough water to drink. She did this several times, each time thanking Ursa with a pat or a smile. The human cub's trust touched something deep within Ursa's chest, a feeling of connection that transcended their differences. Time passed slowly in the pit. The sunlight shifted, throwing shadows across the dirt floor. Ursa tried several times to dig at the base of the walls, hoping to find a weakness in the structure, but the ground was packed hard, and her claws made little impression. Ruby watched these attempts with hopeful eyes, but as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, that hope dimmed. "We're not getting out, are we?" Ruby asked, her voice small and scared again. "The bad men will come back." Bad men? Ursa didn't understand the words, but something in Ruby's tone made her fur bristle. The cub was afraid of something specific or someone. The humans who had built this trap, perhaps. The ones who had left her here as bait. A sudden noise from above made both of them look up. Ursa's cubs had returned, and they weren't alone. Behind them stood a large, dark figure. Another bear, nearly as big as Ursa herself. "Misha," Ruby breathed, her eyes wide with recognition. The new bear, a male, Ursa realized with a mixture of wariness and hope, peered down into the pit. His eyes, dark and intelligent, took in the scene. Ursa and the human cub, trapped together in this human-made prison. Ursa's cubs danced excitedly around him, making sounds that seemed to convey their distress. The male bear, Misha, Ruby had called him, listened, his head tilted. Then he looked directly at Ursa, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection. "You know him?" Ursa asked Ruby with a questioning grunt, nodding toward the male bear. Ruby nodded eagerly. "Misha," she said again, pointing up at him. "He's my friend. He will help us." Friend? A human cub friends with a male bear? It seemed impossible. Male bears were solitary creatures, often dangerous to cubs, even their own. Yet this one seemed different. He watched Ruby with something like concern in his eyes. Misha began to circle the pit, examining it from all angles. Ursa watched him, hoping desperately that he would find a way to free them. Her cubs followed him, occasionally peering down at their mother and making anxious sounds. But as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, a new sound reached them. The distant but unmistakable sound of human voices. Ruby's body tensed against Ursa's side. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "The bad men who took me from my camping tent. They put me in here to catch you." The voices grew louder, accompanied by the snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves. Humans approaching. Multiple humans by the sound of it. Above them, Misha's massive form suddenly disappeared from view. Ursa's cubs, sensing danger, melted back into the forest as well. Ursa and Ruby were alone again, trapped in the pit with nowhere to hide. Ruby pressed against Ursa, her small body trembling. "Please," she whispered, though Ursa couldn't understand her words. "Please, don't let them take me again." Ursa rose to her feet, positioning herself between Ruby and the approaching humans. She didn't know why she felt so protective of this human cub, this creature so different from herself. But in that moment it didn't matter. Ruby was a cub in danger, and Ursa was a mother. Some things transcended species. The voices grew louder, and then shapes appeared at the edge of the pit. Human shapes, blocking out the fading light. 3 of them, Ursa counted. All male, all large. They wore dark coverings and carried long sticks that Ursa recognized with a jolt of fear. The sticks that made the loud noises, that sent pain from a distance. "Well, well," one of the humans said, his voice harsh and grating to Ursa's ears. "Looks like our little trap worked perfectly. Got ourselves a big mama bear and the brat's still alive too." "Told you she'd go for it," another said, laughing. "These bears, they're suckers for a crying kid. Maternal instinct or some crap like that." The third human leaned over the edge of the pit, pointing his stick directly at Ursa. "Better get the kid out first," he said. "Then we can finish the bear." Finish. Ursa didn't know the word, but she understood the intent in the human's posture, in the way he held the stick. These humans meant to kill her. Ruby seemed to understand too. She darted out from behind Ursa, waving her arms and shouting something up at the humans. Ursa couldn't understand the words, but the defiance in the cub's stance was clear. The humans exchanged looks, then laughed. A sound with no humor in it, a sound that made Ursa's fur stand on end. "Looks like the kids made friends with the beast," the first human said. "How touching." "Doesn't matter," the third replied, adjusting his grip on the stick. "Job's the same. Get the kid, kill the bear, collect the bounty." Ruby screamed as the man raised his stick, aiming it at Ursa's head. She threw herself in front of the bear, her arms outstretched, her face contorted with fear and determination. "No!" she shouted. "Don't hurt Honey. She's my friend." The humans paused, clearly surprised by Ruby's actions. In that moment of hesitation, a thunderous roar split the air, not from Ursa, but from somewhere behind the humans. A massive shape launched itself from the forest's edge. Misha, the male bear, his teeth bared in fury. The humans spun around, their sticks now pointed at this new threat. But they were too slow. Misha slammed into the closest human, sending him flying backward with a terrified scream. The man tumbled over the edge of the pit, landing with a heavy thud on the dirt floor. His stick clattered to the ground beside him. Above, chaos erupted. The remaining two humans were shouting, their sticks making those terrible loud bangs. Misha roared in pain but didn't retreat. From elsewhere in the forest came more roars and the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. The human who had fallen into the pit scrambled to his feet, reaching for his fallen stick. Without hesitation, Ursa charged, her massive weight knocking him back to the ground before he could grasp the weapon. She pinned him with one huge paw, a growl rumbling deep in her throat. One bite, one swipe of her claws, and this human would never threaten her or any cub again. But Ruby's small hand on her fur made her pause. The human cub was looking at her with pleading eyes. "Don't kill him," she seemed to say. "Please, don't kill him." Ursa hesitated, torn between her instinct to eliminate the threat and her unwillingness to traumatize this cub further. The human beneath her paw was frozen in terror, his eyes squeezed shut, his body trembling. Above them, the sounds of battle continued. More bears had joined the fray, not just Misha, but several others, including an enormous female that Ursa recognized as Sierra, a bear she had encountered occasionally in her territory. Sierra had no cubs of her own, but she was known among the bears for her fierce protection of the forest and its inhabitants. Something small and furry tumbled over the edge of the pit, followed by another. Ursa's cubs. They had returned with reinforcements, summoning help in their own way. They scampered to their mother's side, nudging at her legs and making urgent sounds. The human beneath Ursa's paw took advantage of her momentary distraction, wriggling free and making a grab for his stick. But before he could reach it, Ruby darted forward and kicked it away, sending it skittering across the dirt floor. "Bad man," she shouted, her small face fierce with anger. "You can't hurt my bears." The human stared at Ruby in disbelief, then at the bear family surrounding her. For a moment, no one moved. Then, overhead, a human scream cut through the air, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. The other humans were fleeing. The man in the pit looked up at the opening above, then back at Ursa and her cubs. His face pale, he pressed himself against the wall, as far from them as he could get in the confined space. Ursa gathered her cubs close, nuzzling them to ensure they were unharmed. They pressed against her, whimpering softly, clearly distressed by everything that had happened. Ruby approached cautiously, her hand outstretched toward the cubs. Ursa watched her carefully but allowed the contact. Her cubs, curious despite their fear, sniffed at Ruby's hand. A shadow fell across them. Misha had returned to the edge of the pit. Blood matted the fur on his shoulder, but he stood strong, his eyes fixed on Ursa and the cubs, all the cubs, including Ruby. Behind him appeared Sierra, her massive form silhouetted against the fading light. Other bears gathered as well, forming a protective circle around the pit. Ursa had never seen such behavior from her kind before. Bears were solitary creatures, coming together only to mate or to fish in particularly abundant streams. Yet here they were, united in defense of one of their own, and a human cub. Ursa looked at Ruby, who was gently petting Tiny while Brave watched with curious eyes. something extraordinary had happened here. Something that defied the natural order of things. A human cub and a bear family, united against a common enemy. But they were still trapped, and the human in the pit with them was a dangerous, unpredictable presence. Night was falling. The forest would soon be dark, and who knew what other dangers might emerge from the shadows. As if sensing her thoughts, Misha made a low, grunting sound. He disappeared from view for a moment, then returned, dragging something long and woody, a fallen branch, thick and sturdy. He positioned it at the edge of the pit, then slowly, carefully, lowered it down, creating a makeshift ladder. The human in the pit saw the opportunity and lunged for it, clearly intending to climb out and escape. But Sierra's massive paw slammed down on the top of the branch, holding it in place. She bared her teeth at the human, a clear warning. The message was understood. The human backed away, his eyes darting between the bears above and those within the pit. Ruby looked at the branch, then at Ursa, her eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. "Can we get out now?" she asked, pointing to the branch. Ursa nudged her cubs toward the branch, encouraging them to climb. They were young but agile, and with her guidance they began to make their way up the makeshift ladder. Ruby watched, then followed, her movements slower and more careful than the bear cubs, but determined nonetheless. Ursa remained at the bottom, her eyes fixed on the human. He couldn't be allowed to follow them out. Not after what he had done, not with the danger he posed. The human seemed to understand this. He pressed himself further into the corner, making himself as small as possible. Once Ruby and the cubs were safely at the top, gathered among the protective circle of bears, Ursa began her own ascent. The branch creaked under her weight, but held. As she reached the top, strong jaws grasped her scruff, Misha helping to pull her the final distance to safety. And then they were all free, Ursa, her cubs, Ruby, and the forest bears who had come to their aid. The human remained trapped in the pit, a fitting reversal of the trap he had set for others. The forest was dark now, the moon rising above the trees. Ruby shivered in the cool night air, her thin coverings offering little protection against the chill. Without hesitation, Ursa moved to her side, offering her warmth. Ruby leaned against her, her small face reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "I want to go home," she whispered, though Ursa couldn't understand the words. "But I don't know the way." Misha approached, his movements cautious and respectful. He sniffed at Ruby, then at Ursa's cubs, who watched him with wide, curious eyes. He made a soft grunting sound, then turned and began to walk toward the forest's edge, looking back expectantly. Ursa understood. Misha knew where Ruby belonged. He could lead them to her home, her human family. But did Ursa want to enter human territory, to venture into the danger and uncertainty of the human world? Her cubs would be at risk. She herself would be vulnerable. Every instinct told her to retreat deeper into the forest, to return to the safety of her territory. Yet, as she looked at Ruby, this small, brave human cub who had stood between her and danger, Ursa knew she couldn't abandon her. Not when the journey to safety remained, not when Ruby needed her. With a soft grunt to her cubs, Ursa nudged Ruby toward Misha. The human cub seemed to understand. She reached up and wrapped her arms around Ursa's neck in a gesture that Ursa had never experienced before. An embrace, a human sign of affection and gratitude. "Thank you, honey," Ruby whispered against Ursa's fur. "You saved me." And so, under the watchful eyes of the forest bears, Ursa, her cubs, Ruby, and Misha began their journey through the moonlit forest. A strange procession, united by forces older and stronger than the ancient rivalries between their kinds. A bear family and a human cub, bound by an unexpected encounter and an unbreakable connection. Behind them, from the depths of the pit, came the frightened calls of the trapped human. But no one turned back. Some traps were meant to be escaped from, and some were meant to be learned from. This human would have time to consider his actions before his companions returned for him, if they returned at all. Ahead lay an uncertain path. Ursa didn't know what awaited them in the human world, or how she would ensure Ruby's safe return. But she knew, with the certainty of a mother's heart, that she would protect this cub, this strange, hairless, two-legged cub, with the same fierce devotion she gave her own. They moved through the forest, a family unlike any other, guided by moonlight and mutual trust. The night was long, but they were together, and for now, that was enough. The forest at night was a different world, shadows shifting between trees, eyes gleaming in the darkness, sounds amplified in the quiet. For Ursa, these night sounds were familiar, comforting even. She knew which rustles meant danger and which were merely the nocturnal creatures going about their business. But Ruby clung to her fur, startling at every hoot of an owl or crack of a branch. "It's so dark," Ruby whispered, her voice small against the vastness of the forest. She stumbled over a root, would have fallen if not for Ursa's steady presence beside her. "I can't see anything." Ursa nudged the child gently, encouraging her to keep moving. Unlike humans, bears could see reasonably well in the dark, their other senses compensating for what their vision lacked. Ursa's cubs trotted alongside them, occasionally darting ahead to investigate an interesting smell or sound, but never straying far from their mother. Misha led the way, his massive form a darker shadow against the night. He moved with surprising grace for such a large creature, choosing paths that would be navigable for both bears and the small human cub. Every so often, he would stop and sniff the air, as if confirming they were still heading in the right direction. Behind them, Sierra and 2 other bears from the rescue party followed at a respectful distance. They were sentinels, Ursa realized, protection against any pursuit from the humans they had left behind. "Where are we going?" Ruby asked, the question directed at Misha. The male bear didn't respond, of course, couldn't respond in any way the human child could understand, but Ruby spoke to him as if expecting an answer. "Are we going to my mommy and daddy? Do you know where they are?" Ursa watched this one-sided conversation with curiosity. The human cub clearly had some prior connection with Misha. But how? Male bears rarely interacted with human cubs, or any cubs for that matter, without aggression. Yet Misha showed none of the typical male bear behaviors toward Ruby. No aggression, no dominance displays, only a gentle watchfulness that reminded Ursa of herself. As they walked, Ruby began to talk more, perhaps to distract herself from the darkness and the strange journey. "I was camping with Mommy and Daddy," she said, her small hand clutched in Ursa's fur. "We were in our tent, and I was sleeping between them. Then I woke up, and these men were there. They put something over Mommy's mouth when she tried to scream, and they grabbed me and ran away." Ursa couldn't understand the specific words, but the distress in Ruby's voice was clear. The cub had been taken from her parents by the same humans who had set the trap, stolen from her family, just as they had intended to steal Ursa from hers. "Misha tried to help," Ruby continued, looking up at the large bear ahead of them. "He came running when he heard me screaming. He lives near our campsite, and Daddy's been leaving food for him. Daddy studies bears. He's a science person. He puts little cameras in the trees to watch bears, but he never hurts them." This was all gibberish to Ursa, but she sensed that Ruby was explaining the connection between herself and Misha. Somehow, this human cub's family had formed a relationship with the male bear, something unprecedented in Ursa's experience. They walked for what seemed like hours, the forest around them gradually changing. The trees grew thinner, farther apart. The underbrush became less dense. Ursa could smell water ahead, not a small creek like the one near her den, but something larger. A lake, perhaps, or a wide river. She also smelled humans, many humans, and felt a prickle of fear along her spine. They were approaching human territory. The danger was increasing with every step. Misha seemed to sense her hesitation. He stopped and turned, his eyes meeting hers in the darkness. A silent communication passed between them, reassurance from him, uncertainty from her. Then he looked at Ruby, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was half asleep against Ursa's side, stumbling forward only through the bear's guidance. The message was clear. The human cub needed to return to her own kind. As much as Ursa might wish to keep Ruby safe in the forest, away from the humans who had used her so cruelly, she knew that wasn't possible. Ruby belonged with her human parents, just as Ursa's cubs belonged with her. With a soft grunt of acknowledgement, Ursa nudged her cubs forward. They would continue, despite the danger. As they approached the edge of the forest, the trees opened up to reveal a large body of water. A lake, its surface glittering under the moonlight. Along its far shore, Ursa could see the unmistakable signs of human presence. Square structures with glowing lights, hard paths where the natural ground had been covered with human materials, and the distant sounds of their activities, muted at this late hour, but still detectable to her sensitive ears. Ruby perked up at the sight, suddenly more awake. "That's the lake," she exclaimed, pointing. "That's where we were camping." She tugged at Ursa's fur, trying to urge her forward, out of the protective cover of the trees. "Mommy and Daddy might still be there. They might be looking for me." But Ursa hesitated. The open space between the forest and the lake offered no protection, no place to hide if danger appeared. And the human settlement, with its unnatural lights and sounds, represented everything she had been taught to fear. Sierra and the other bears had stopped at the forest's edge, clearly unwilling to venture any farther. Only Misha seemed prepared to continue, his eyes fixed on Ruby with something like determination. Ruby looked up at Ursa, her small face pleading in the moonlight. "Please," she said, though Ursa couldn't understand the word. "Please help me find them." Ursa looked down at her own cubs. They were tired, their small eyes drooping with exhaustion. They had been through so much already: the trap, the humans with their terrible sticks, this long night journey. They needed safety, rest. But so did Ruby. Making her decision, Ursa gently nudged her cubs toward Sierra. The female bear understood immediately. She moved forward, gathering the cubs close to her with soft, maternal sounds. She would protect them while Ursa completed this final task. Freed from the immediate responsibility of her cubs, Ursa turned her attention fully to Ruby. The human cub had watched this exchange with wide, understanding eyes. She reached up and wrapped her arms around Ursa's neck once more, burying her face in the bear's thick fur. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're the bravest, kindest bear in the whole world." Together, Ursa, Ruby, and Misha emerged from the forest's edge. The open ground felt exposed and dangerous to Ursa, every instinct screaming at her to return to the safety of the trees. But Ruby's hand in her fur, and Misha's steady presence beside them, gave her the courage to continue. They skirted the edge of the lake, staying as close to the tree line as possible, while still making progress toward the human settlement. Ruby grew more animated with each step, her eyes scanning the collection of human structures, searching for something familiar. "There," she suddenly cried, pointing to a cluster of fabric structures set slightly apart from the more permanent buildings. "That's where we were camping. I recognize those tents." Ursa followed Ruby's gaze. She could see the shapes the child was indicating. Temporary human shelters made of thin material, nothing like the sturdy dens that bears created. Around these shelters, figures moved, humans, many of them, their voices carrying across the still water of the lake. "They're still looking for me," Ruby whispered, her voice a mixture of hope and disbelief. "They didn't leave. Mommy and Daddy didn't leave without me." Misha made a soft grunting sound, then looked at Ursa. His message was clear. They could go no closer. This was as far as their protection could extend. The rest of the journey was Ruby's alone. But Ruby seemed suddenly hesitant, clinging to Ursa's fur. "What if the bad men are there too?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if they try to take me again? What if they try to hurt you?" Ursa couldn't understand the specific fears, but she sensed Ruby's sudden reluctance. She nuzzled the child gently, trying to provide reassurance. "I don't want to leave you," Ruby said, tears welling in her eyes. "You saved me. You and Misha saved me." From across the water came a sudden shout, a human voice calling a word repeatedly. "Ruby! Ruby!" The sound carried clearly in the night air. Ruby's head snapped up, her entire body tensing. "That's my daddy!" she gasped. "That's his voice." She took a step forward, then stopped, looking back at Ursa and Misha uncertainly. The calling continued, joined by another voice, higher, more desperate. "Ruby, baby, where are you?" "And that's my mommy," Ruby whispered, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Ursa nudged her gently, encouraging her to go toward the voices, toward her own family. This was right. This was as it should be. Cubs belonged with their parents. Ruby took another step, then another, moving away from the bears and toward the human encampment. But after a few paces she turned and ran back, throwing her arms around Ursa's neck one last time. "I'll never forget you," she said, her voice choked with tears. "Never, ever. I'll come back to the forest someday and look for you. I promise." Then she turned to Misha, wrapping her arms around his massive neck as well. The male bear tolerated this human display of affection with remarkable patience. "Take care of them," Ruby whispered to him. "Take care of Honey and her babies." With that, Ruby turned and began to run across the open ground toward the human voices. "Mommy! Daddy!" she called, her small voice carrying across the lake. "I'm here. I'm over here." The response was immediate. Shouts of joy and disbelief, the sounds of many humans moving quickly, lights swinging in their direction. Ursa tensed, ready to charge forward if these humans proved to be a threat to Ruby. But Misha made a soft sound beside her, a reassurance. These were Ruby's family, her protectors, not like the humans who had set the trap. They watched as Ruby was swept up into the arms of two larger humans, all three of them clinging to each other, making those strange sounds that humans made when they were overcome with emotion. Other humans gathered around them, some holding those bright light sticks, others talking rapidly into small devices. And then, something unexpected happened. Ruby pulled away from her parents and pointed back toward the forest edge, toward where Ursa and Misha stood partially concealed by the last few trees. She seemed to be telling her parents something important, gesturing emphatically. The larger humans looked in their direction. One of them, the male, Ruby's father, took a step forward, then another. He raised one hand in a gesture that wasn't threatening, but rather seemed almost like acknowledgement, gratitude. "Thank you," the human called across the distance. the words meaningless to Ursa, but the tone clear enough. "Thank you for bringing her back to us." Beside him, the female human, Ruby's mother, was weeping, holding Ruby tightly against her chest, but looking toward the bears with an expression of wonder and tearful gratitude. Ursa and Misha stood their ground, neither advancing nor retreating. A moment of connection stretched between species that had been enemies for centuries. A fragile, unprecedented peace built on the foundation of a child saved and returned. Then more humans began to approach, some carrying those dangerous sticks. Ruby's father turned and said something sharp to them, a command perhaps, and they stopped advancing. But the moment of peace was broken. It was time to leave. Ursa nudged Misha, and together they turned back toward the forest. Ruby's voice called after them, "Goodbye, honey." "Goodbye, Misha." But they didn't look back. Their task was complete. The human cub was safe with her own kind. They slipped back into the protective darkness of the trees, where Sierra waited with Ursa's cubs. The young bears bounded to their mother, nuzzling against her with relieved whimpers. They had been brave during her absence, but they had missed her terribly. As they prepared to journey back into the deep forest, back to their own territory and the safety of familiar surroundings, Ursa cast one last look toward the lake. In the distance, she could still see the cluster of humans, the lights, and at the center the small figure of Ruby, still watching the forest edge, one hand raised in farewell. A strange feeling tugged at Ursa's heart, a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. She had done something no bear had done before. She had formed a bond with a human cub, had protected her as one of her own, and now she had let her go, returned her to where she belonged. With a soft grunt to her cubs and a respectful nod to Misha and Sierra, Ursa turned and led the way deeper into the forest. The night's adventure was over. It was time to go home. But little did Ursa know, their extraordinary encounter had set events in motion that would soon transform the forest, the lake, and the relationship between bears and humans forever. 3 days later, Ursa and her cubs had almost reached their home territory. The journey had been slow, partly because the cubs tired easily and partly because Ursa had taken a circuitous route, avoiding the area where the pit trap had been set. She had no desire to encounter those particular humans again, the ones with the cruel eyes and deadly sticks. Misha had accompanied them for the first day, a silent, protective presence that Ursa found herself appreciating more than she would have thought possible. Male bears were typically not to be trusted around cubs, but Misha had proven himself different. He had helped save her cubs and Ruby from the humans. He had led them safely to the lake where Ruby's family waited, and he had respected Ursa's space and authority over her cubs, never challenging her decisions or attempting to assert dominance. When they had reached the border of what Ursa considered safe territory, Misha had stopped. He and Ursa had exchanged a long look, acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even something more. Then he had turned and disappeared into the forest, heading back in the direction of the lake and the human settlement. Ursa's cubs had seemed sad to see him go. They had grown accustomed to his presence, even playing near him when the group stopped to rest. It was an unusual relationship, but then again, everything about the past few days had been unusual. Now, as they approached the familiar scents and sounds of their home range, Ursa felt herself relaxing for the first time since she had first detected the human scent near the berry clearing. Soon they would be back at their den, tucked safely away from the dangers of the wider forest. She would have time to hunt, to replenish her strength, to watch her cubs grow stronger and more independent with each passing day. As they crested a small hill, Ursa froze. Something was wrong. The scent of their territory had changed. Mixed with the familiar smells of their den and the surrounding vegetation was a new scent. Human. Not just one human, but many. And something else. A sharp, unnatural smell that made her nose wrinkle in disgust. She signaled for her cubs to stay close as she cautiously moved forward. The trees thinned ahead, opening onto a small valley where a stream ran clear and cold, part of her territory, a place where she often fished for trout when they were running. But what she saw there made her heart pound with fear and rage. Humans, dozens of them. They had built those strange temporary shelters along the bank of the stream. Their hard-shelled traveling beasts sat idle nearby, gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. And the humans themselves moved about purposefully, carrying objects, talking to one another, pointing at things in the forest. Ursa's first instinct was to flee, to take her cubs and run as far as possible from this human invasion. But where would they go? This was their home. The den where they had sheltered since the cubs' birth was just beyond the stream, in the hillside overlooking the valley. Their hunting grounds, their fishing spots, their pathways through the forest, all were here, in this territory that had been Ursa's for 3 seasons. As she watched in dismay, trying to decide what to do, one of the humans separated from the group and walked to the edge of the stream. He was tall and lean, with fur the color of autumn leaves on his head, the same unusual color as Ruby's. He stood quietly, looking out over the water, then turned and scanned the forest's edge slowly, methodically, as if searching for something. Or someone. With a jolt, Ursa realized this might be Ruby's father, the science person who studied bears, as Ruby had tried to explain. Had he followed them here? Was he looking for her specifically? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Was this human like the ones who had set the trap? Or was he different, as Ruby had seemed to think? Before she could decide on a course of action, a commotion erupted among the human group. Several of them were pointing excitedly at something on the ground. Ruby's father, if that's who he was, hurried over to see what they had found. Ursa couldn't see what had caused their excitement, but she could hear their voices, their tone suggesting discovery and triumph. After a moment, the red-haired human straightened and looked directly toward the forest's edge. Directly, it seemed, toward Ursa herself, though she was sure she was well hidden behind the thick foliage. He said something to the others, then began walking purposefully toward the trees. Toward her. Ursa tensed, ready to defend her cubs if necessary. But the human stopped a respectful distance from the forest's edge. He carried no stick weapon, she noted. His hands were empty, held slightly away from his sides in what seemed like a deliberate posture of non-threat. "I know you're there," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "I won't come any closer. I just want to thank you." Ursa remained frozen, unsure whether to retreat deeper into the forest or stand her ground. Her cubs pressed against her legs, sensing her tension. "Ruby told us everything," the human continued. "How you protected her from those poachers. How you and the other bear, Misha, she calls him, brought her back to us." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I've studied bears for 15 years, and I've never heard of anything like it. You saved my daughter's life." He reached slowly into a pocket of his covering and removed something small. Ursa tensed again, but it wasn't a weapon, just a small flat object that glinted in the sunlight. "This is Ruby's," he said, holding it up so it caught the light. "She wanted you to have it, to remember her by." He bent down and placed the object on a flat rock at the forest's edge, then backed away several paces. "We're not here to hurt you or any bears. We're trying to protect this forest. Those men who trapped you, they're part of a poaching operation. They've been killing bears and selling their gallbladders on the black market. We're here to stop them." Ursa couldn't understand the specific words, of course, but the human's tone was calm, respectful. He made no threatening moves. After another moment, he backed away further, returning to the group by the stream. For a long time, Ursa remained hidden, watching the humans go about their activities. None approached the forest's edge again. None carried the stick weapons that had hurt her before. They seemed focused on their tasks, setting up equipment, examining things, writing in those flat objects humans were always carrying. Curiosity, that dangerous trait again, finally overcame her caution. When the humans moved to the far side of their camp, gathered around something that produced the smell of food, Ursa carefully approached the edge of the forest. Her cubs tried to follow, but she firmly directed them to stay hidden. This was a risk she would take alone. She reached the rock where Ruby's father had placed the small object. It was a necklace, she saw now, a thin cord threaded through a small pendant shaped like a bear. The pendant was made of some hard, shiny material, cool to the touch when Ursa nudged it with her nose. It carried Ruby's scent faintly, along with other human smells. A gift. A token of remembrance, as the human had said. Ursa didn't understand human customs, but she understood gratitude. She understood connection. Gently, carefully, she picked up the necklace in her mouth and retreated back into the forest where her cubs waited. For the rest of the day, she observed the human camp from a safe distance. They made no attempt to approach her territory or her den. They stayed near the stream, their activities mysterious but seemingly non-threatening. Occasionally, the red-haired human would look toward the forest, as if hoping for another glimpse of her. But he never ventured closer. As darkness fell, Ursa made her decision. She would not abandon her territory, not yet, at least. She would watch these humans, learn their intentions. If they proved to be a threat, she would take her cubs and find a new home. But if not, if they were truly as different from the trap-setting humans as Ruby had been different from them, perhaps some kind of coexistence was possible. It was an unprecedented thought for a bear, a species that had learned through bitter experience to fear and avoid humans at all costs. But then again, Ursa had experienced something unprecedented, a connection with a human cub that had awakened something new within her, a capacity to see beyond species boundaries, to recognize kinship in the most unlikely places. She looked down at her own cubs, now curled together in sleep, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. And she thought of Ruby, returned safely to her human parents. Different in form and language, yet so similar in what mattered most. A cub in need of protection, of guidance, of love. With the bear pendant clutched gently between her paws, Ursa settled herself protectively around her cubs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But for tonight, they were safe. And somewhere across the forest, she knew Ruby was safe too. The bond forged between them, bear and human, rescuer and rescued, would not be broken by distance or difference. It remained, a fragile bridge across an ancient divide. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something much larger than either of them could imagine. Ruby couldn't sleep. She lay in her sleeping bag between her parents, listening to her father's gentle snoring and her mother's soft breathing. The familiar sounds should have comforted her, should have lulled her into the deep sleep that had eluded her since her rescue 3 days ago. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pit, the poachers, the look in Honey's eyes when she realized she had fallen into a trap. Carefully, so as not to wake her parents. They'd barely let her out of their sight since getting her back. Ruby sat up and peered out the open flap of their tent. The campground was quiet. Most of the search parties had disbanded once she'd been found, the volunteers returning to their homes or their interrupted vacations. Only her father's research team remained. Their purpose shifted from finding Ruby to documenting the extraordinary bear behavior she had witnessed. No one had believed her at first. A mother bear protecting a human child? Bears working together to rescue one of their own? It sounded like the product of trauma and imagination, they'd said. A coping mechanism, the child psychologist had suggested during a hurried phone consultation. Let her tell her story, he advised, but don't expect it to be factually accurate. Then, Misha had been spotted near the campground, his distinctive scar making him instantly recognizable to her father, who had been studying him for months. And the poacher they'd arrested, the one who'd been trapped in the pit, had corroborated parts of her story during questioning, describing in disbelieving terms how the bears had worked together, how the female bear had shown protective behavior toward Ruby. Suddenly, her father's colleagues were interested. Very interested. What had been a small research project studying black bear behavior had transformed overnight into a multi-university expedition, with funding pouring in from conservation groups eager to document this unprecedented interspecies cooperation. Ruby sighed and hugged her knees to her chest. She should be happy. She was safe. The bad men, as she thought of them, were in jail. Her parents were here, but she couldn't stop thinking about Honey and her cubs. Were they safe? Had they found their way home? Would the poacher's friends come looking for them, seeking revenge? Can't sleep again? Her mother's soft voice made Ruby turn. Lisa Morgan was sitting up, her long hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes soft with concern. She reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Ruby's face. Another bad dream? Ruby shook her head. I wasn't dreaming. I was thinking about Honey. Her mother's expression softened further. Unlike some of the others, Lisa had never questioned Ruby's account of what happened. She had listened, had held her daughter while she talked about the mother bear who had protected her, had comforted her when she cried for the cubs she had left behind in the forest. You miss her, Lisa said. It wasn't a question. Ruby nodded, feeling tears well up again. Do you think she's okay? Your father thinks they've found signs of her, Lisa said, pulling Ruby close against her side. Those tracks today near the stream? He thinks they might be hers. Hope surged through Ruby. Really? Is he sure? Not sure, Lisa admitted. But he's setting up wildlife cameras tonight. If she's out there, if she's still in this part of the forest, we'll know soon. Ruby leaned against her mother, drawing comfort from her warmth and the familiar scent of her shampoo. I gave her my necklace, she confessed, the one with the bear pendant that Grandma gave me. Dad promised to leave it for her. I know, sweetheart. That was a lovely thing to do. Do you think she understood that it was a present? Lisa hesitated. I don't know, she said finally. Bears don't think the way we do, but I think she understood that you care about her. Animals can sense that kind of thing. Ruby nodded, satisfied with this answer. She was about to lie back down when a movement outside the tent caught her eye. Something large and dark, moving silently at the edge of the camp where the forest began. Her heart leapt. Mom, she whispered urgently. Mom, look. Lisa followed her gaze, tensing when she saw the shape. She reached for her husband, shaking him awake. Jacob, she hissed. Jacob, wake up. Jacob Bennett came awake instantly, years of field research having trained him to respond quickly to middle-of-the-night alerts. What is it? He asked, already reaching for his glasses. At the tree line, Lisa whispered. I think it's a bear. Jacob peered out of the tent, then reached slowly for the powerful flashlight they kept nearby. Stay here, he murmured. carefully unzipping the tent flap. "Both of you, stay inside." "No." Ruby caught his arm. "Don't scare her away. It might be Honey." Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but stay in the tent. Promise me." Ruby nodded reluctantly. She watched as her father slipped out of the tent, moving slowly and deliberately, the flashlight in his hand, but not yet turned on. He walked a few paces from the tent, then stopped, making himself visible but non-threatening. The shape at the forest's edge shifted, and Ruby caught her breath. It was a bear, a large, female black bear with a distinctive copper-colored coat that gleamed dully in the moonlight. And beside her, two small forms, cubs, staying close to their mother's side but clearly curious about the human camp. "Honey," Ruby breathed, her heart swelling with joy and disbelief. She came back. The bear, Honey, Ursa, whatever name she answered to in the language of bears, stood at the border between forest and camp, watching Jacob cautiously. She made no aggressive moves, but she didn't retreat either, even when Jacob took another slow step forward. "What's she doing here?" Lisa whispered, her arm tight around Ruby's shoulders. "Why would she come to a human campsite?" Ruby knew the answer instantly. "She's checking on me," she said with absolute certainty. "She wants to know if I'm okay." Outside, Jacob had stopped moving. He stood perfectly still, allowing the bear to observe him. "Hello again," Ruby heard him say softly. "Thank you for coming back." To Ruby's amazement, her father slowly reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a small object that glinted in the moonlight. He bent and placed it on the ground, then backed away. The bear watched this performance, her head tilted slightly as if in consideration. Then, to the astonishment of all three humans, she moved forward cautiously, her cubs remaining at the forest's edge. She approached the object Jacob had placed on the ground, sniffed it, then gently picked it up in her mouth. Ruby couldn't contain herself any longer. Despite her promise, she slipped out of her mother's grasp and crawled out of the tent. "Honey," she called softly. "It's me. It's Ruby." The bear's head snapped up, eyes focusing immediately on the small figure emerging from the tent. Jacob tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but the bear made no aggressive move. She simply stood, the object, which Ruby now recognized as a small jar of honey from their supplies, held carefully in her mouth. "Ruby, come back here," Lisa urged, her voice tight with fear as she appeared at the tent entrance. But Ruby took another step forward, her eyes locked with the bear's. "You remembered me," she said softly. "You came to check on me." The bear made a soft sound, a rumble deep in her throat that wasn't threatening, but conversational. She placed the honey jar carefully on the ground, nudged it with her nose, as if to acknowledge the gift, then backed away, returning to her cubs at the forest's edge. For a long moment, the two families regarded each other across the distance. Human parents with their child, bear mother with her cubs. Two species bound by the universal language of parenthood and protection. Then, with one last look at Ruby, Ursa turned and led her cubs back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness as silently as she had emerged. Jacob quickly moved to Ruby's side, lifting her into his arms. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a mixture of concern and wonder. Ruby nodded, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the bears had vanished. "She came to say goodbye," she whispered. "Properly this time." Jacob exchanged a look with Lisa over Ruby's head, a look that spoke volumes about the extraordinary event they had just witnessed. Then he carried Ruby back to the tent, where Lisa wrapped her in a blanket and held her close. "Dad?" Ruby asked as they settled back into their sleeping bags. "Will you still study her? Will you make sure she's safe?" Jacob nodded solemnly. "I promise. We'll make sure she and her cubs are protected. In fact," he added, a note of excitement entering his voice, "what we've learned from you, from her, it could change everything about how we understand bear cognition, bear-human interactions. It could help us protect bears everywhere." Ruby smiled, satisfied with this answer. She closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted but peaceful. The fears that had kept her awake were quieted now. Honey had come back. She had shown herself to Ruby one last time, had accepted the gift Jacob offered, had made the connection between them real and undeniable. As she drifted toward sleep, cradled between her parents, Ruby thought she could still hear the soft padding of bear paws on forest soil, still feel the warm, rough texture of Honey's fur against her cheek. The memory would stay with her always. Not just the fear and the danger, but the connection, the trust, the understanding that had bridged the gap between their worlds. In the morning, Jacob's wildlife cameras would reveal something astounding. Footage of Ursa approaching the campsite not once but multiple times over the night. Careful and watchful. A silent guardian ensuring Ruby's safety. The discovery would launch a new era of bear research and conservation efforts, with Ruby's story at its heart. But for now, in the quiet darkness of the tent, Ruby slept peacefully for the first time since her ordeal. And somewhere in the forest, a mother bear guided her cubs home, carrying a jar of honey and memories of a human cub who had changed her understanding of the world forever. The unusual friendship between Ruby and Ursa would become legend in the scientific community and beyond. A testament to the unexpected connections that can form even between ancient enemies when compassion overrides fear. Their story would inspire protection for the forest and its inhabitants, ensuring that the wilderness where their paths had crossed would remain a sanctuary for generations to come. Two mothers, two families, two species, bound by an encounter that began with a trap but ended with understanding. In a world often defined by divisions, their story stood as a reminder that sometimes the most important boundaries are the ones we choose to cross.